think that probably even more from a professional standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that my own growth has accelerated at a much faster rate, of
Mhm.
course, than the people
Mhm.
that I'm seeing.
Mhm.
So it's just very
Mhm.
worthwhile.
Yeah.
To
Sometimes when you're finally involved personally with adoption,
question
you
about it.
can't help but learn from what your kids are saying if you're open to hearing what
It
they're
isn't
saying.
even, my kids are younger, well, one is 8,
Mhm.
you know. I have a 15 and 8 and a 2
Mhm.
and 8 and 2 are by adoption. It's really because I got involved
Mhm.
professionally
Mhm.
that my
Mhm.
education has taken me to the points it has.
Yeah.
Which really says
Right.
what I'm illustrating before, people who are not going to become involved
Mhm.
professionally, which is over 99% of the people I see,
Mhm.
are not going to put
Mhm.
themselves in the position of, you
Yeah.
know, I mean, I can give them a minimal bibliography,
Mhm.
which your
Mhm.
book is on it, as well as some other, I think, very fine readings. How much can you hit them over the head with? When
Mhm.
they come to see me, they want to know, how do I get a baby?
Mhm. Mhm.
And in
Mhm.
Illinois, for example, which is
Mhm.
where my practice is, you do not need to have a home study.
Mm.
So I
Is
need to
that
really-
right?
A pre-home study. Everyone has
Mm.
post-placement, but
Mhm.
I need to really urge them
Mhm.
to do
Mhm.
this anyway,
Mhm.
for many reasons.
Sure.
One of which, to some people, I really can't communicate, and
Mhm.
that is, I want you to get this education.
That's
and
right.
Hopefully, if you're
That's
going
right.
through an agency that has some decent education
Mhm.
in services and meetings,
Mhm.
you're going to get some of this stuff whether you wanted it or not.
That's right.
It will open up some.
Sure.
By
Sure.
the time I'm done meeting with them, I've seen people come from here to
Mhm.
here. And I
Mhm.
hope that they'll just keep taking
Yeah.
some itty-bitty
Yeah.
steps along the way.
Yeah.
Because many of them are totally
Mhm.
ignorant and naive. And I
Mhm.
don't mean that in a negative
Mhm.
way, but
Mhm.
they just, they don't
Mhm.
have the opportunity.
Mhm.
I was in that position.
Sure.
I had
Sure.
absolutely no opportunity for
Mhm.
education. It was,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
both of our adoptions were private. The first
Mhm.
time my family was looked at was in post-placement
Mhm.
supervision.
Mhm.
And that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah. 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 I understand.
So, I would like, you know, just about everyone I see to
Mhm.
be successful.
Mhm.
However, there's other stuff that they're
Mhm.
stuck hearing.
Mhm.
Or they
Mhm.
get just the
Mhm.
resources and
Right.
who's good out there and how to
Mhm.
market themselves and all
Mhm.
the other
Mhm.
things.
There's so many
Communicate
angles.
with birth parents.
Mhm.
It's really
Mhm.
powerful.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's exciting
Okay.
because it's ethical. It's
Sure,
honest,
sure.
so.
Well, and I think that's a big core issue in any of these fields where you're dealing with people and emotions. So, okay, well, as we bring up whatever it is we would like to touch on, that's okay. We'll just refer back. How about you? What are you hoping to glean?
I'm really open to a wide range.
Mhm.
That's why I really enjoy this conference.
Mhm.
I'm a family therapist,
Mhm.
and I really have worked really across the board with this issue. But it's interesting that when you were commenting before about the people from the past,
Mhm.
I suspect that I probably have
Mhm.
some things that I really
Mhm.
operate more from the past, and I think
Mhm.
I want to know
Mhm.
more.
Mhm.
Last year when I went to the New York conference, when I came out, I felt that just being at the conference
Mhm.
physically
Mhm.
and talking to people who were so
Mhm.
more personally involved than
Yes.
I was as worthwhile as anything else that I would
Absolutely.
get at the conference. Since then, my wife is the adoption coordinator for our agency, so
Mhm.
it's another link. And last year we drove an adoptee who was involved in a search to the conference.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we just off the lift, and neither of us knew her. And a lot of the personal listening to her
Mhm.
specifically
Mhm.
was
Mhm.
very useful for us.
Mhm. Mhm.
I had in the 60s direct professional interest in a foster agency
Mhm.
where they had children in foster care who were actually adopted by the foster family, but on a
Mhm.
legal basis were not, and they were like these long-term placements.
Mhm.
And I was part of 2 reunions
Mhm.
with birth parents in that. I think that experience stayed with me,
Mhm.
and I think I've used that. So when I hear what is now more modern and more about open, etc.,
Yes.
it's always fit comfortably for me.
Mhm.
One of the reasons for me to be at the conferences really is that because I think it fits for me,
Mhm.
I've never had the problems that I think some of my coworkers have.
Mhm, mhm,
And
mhm.
I'm not as sensitive to their issues
Yes.
really as I need to be, because I
Mhm.
can't argue properly yet.
Mhm, mhm.
And that's a big piece of what I think I do. And I
Mhm.
do a lot of training of family therapists, and I want them to be coming from the right place on
Yeah,
these issues.
yeah.
So,
Mhm, mhm.
and then specifically, I have a few families right now that I'm really hoping to just pick
Mhm.
up some ideas that might help
Mhm, mhm. Okay.
for those families that are struggling and that I was working
Mhm.
with.
And just like you said that something that impacted you so dramatically was speaking directly with individuals who were personally involved and driving this person to the conference,
Wonderful, right.
I have found in doing education with whatever group I speak with that not only do I come in as the professional rounding out the picture, but I use panels a lot, bringing in the principals so that they can hear these stories directly, and then my usual, again, rounding out of the information is to say, while you are hearing the story of this one person, I can assure you that you can generalize from this person's story to the core issues for persons in his role, to try to expand their horizons, because it is a consistent message that we get from each of the roles. I would say it's like a script. When I began doing my work in post-adoption, it was at a time when there were not agencies around the country doing this. There were 2 other agencies that were offering post-adoption services, and their major focus was counseling. Our major focus started off as education and very rapidly moved into searching. And I began to call it a script because even though I had read it in all the books that were available at the time, and the educational process that we had gone through told me the things that I was witnessing on the phone or in person, it wasn't until I realized what a dramatic and intense script it was that I began to internalize it at a really emotional level. And so I could pick up the telephone and talk with an adopted person, and I could predict what that person was going to say as time went by, so that I could anticipate what they were going to say and give them the permission to say what hadn't been said yet. And so I find that a lot of what I do in working with any of the parties is a mingling of education and counseling, because one of the basic premises that I go by is that each one of us involved with adoption, no matter what our role is, must first understand our own particular issues and how we are totally normal in dealing with our own issues, getting in touch with them, feeling okay about it, and then becoming totally competent in having empathy and understanding for the issues of the other parties. So it's through that empathy and understanding that we then can take the steps that we need to take to do what needs to be done in adoption. But that fits for adoption professionals, adoptive parents, birth parents, and adoptees, because we truly often do not understand our own role and its issues, and we truly often do not understand the issues for the other roles.
I really relate to what you're saying because the new definition,
Mhm.
versus the old book, has, the new little addendum on about extended, and I'm having trouble with that. The rest of it feels okay. And I'm sure that new part has to do with my not yet clear. So here I am beginning this search. I can't answer yet what the end part is going to be. 'Cause I'm not- And that part, I am uncomfortable with that
Yeah.
additional
Mhm.
after the comma.
Mhm.
New.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And I will tell you quite honestly, again, practicing in the Midwest, that most of the people that I see,
Mhm.
well, they're uncomfortable with the first part too,
Yes.
which I
Mhm.
am totally
Mhm. Mhm.
trying
Mhm.
to educate them about.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's geographical too.
Mm-hmm. And just working through our feelings regarding all those issues. What Ellen is alluding to is that in our new book, Children of Open Adoption, the definition of the open adoption experience has been expanded, as well as the relationships that are involved. And what we are putting forward is that these children that we are adopting, their birth families are their families. And therefore, it's that acknowledgement of how we all came together that, in fact, we therefore become connected as family. Along maybe the ways of in-laws, where you have varying degrees of relationships with in-laws, and you become related by that factor.
I think the acknowledgement part is okay, it's just how much then they come over, or they may be involved, or they are a physical, active part of, which I know is not always the case, but the availability and the open-mindedness
Right.
to that
Right.
possibility
Right.
is where I, right now, am stopped on a personal level. So, and I think that that comes with the definition,
Sure,
is to
sure.
be able to accept the fact
That's
that
right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. What is your feeling about when do we start to, well, let me go back up a little bit, just so you know a little bit about me. I was a school counselor for many, many years and worked primarily with middle school kids and had some experiences that were adoption related, but very few really knew nothing about adoption when I then approached it on my own because of my own needs. And we had been involved with infertility for several years and then decided that the turning point was we were ready to adopt. We were very fortunate in that we were involved with Lutheran Social Service, which at the time was not yet a national leader in the practice of open adoption, but very quickly evolved into one. And by then I was totally immersed as a volunteer and then as the director of their post-adoption program. So the intertwining of the programs was very definite in that open adoption was the obvious answer once you were immersed in post-adoption, because post-adoption opens your eyes to what the realities of being adopted and being a birth parent and being an adoptive parent. So the intertwining of the programs was just a very natural flow, and it was very impacting in terms of our philosophy about how adoptions should be. And that's how the program evolved, how the whole open adoption program evolved. My kids are 9.5 and 11.5, so I have my own personal laboratory, if you like, in terms of observing the issues from the time that they were very small over time, and then of course professionally. Right now I'm in private practice, and my practice is totally adoption focused. And I do counseling with prospective adoptive parents as well as people already involved with adoption. Typically my involvement is brief counseling because I spend a tremendous amount of time doing searching. And I will do searching for any of the parties. I will do searching on behalf of minors, both from the birth parent side as well as the adoptive parent side. So I'll address some of what I will say from those angles and how I work with people. And I have agencies that will entrust their files to me so that I will act as an intermediary when that is the case, preparing people and then processing with them as we go along. Additionally, I have people from anywhere in the country that I will work with to access files if it seems realistic that I can access a file for them. I will only take on cases that seem realistic for me because, of course, I'm charging people, and therefore I feel I have to be judicious in terms of which cases I take on. And so I, therefore, am involved from many different directions. My personal belief is that adoptive parents who are or prospective adoptive parents need to start thinking about the concept of the search even then. Of course, with open adoption, there is no need for search. But the reality is that not all adoptions in our country are open at this time. There's been a lot of progress and movement, but we still have a long way to go. So it's very vitally important to start educating adoptive parents from the time that they're contemplating adoption to the over time needs of that child to know and have contact with birth family, to help them understand so that they don't end up feeling threatened, which is so often what happens. And of course, because of a myriad number of issues for adoptive parents, particularly infertility and entitlement, they tend to be very possessive of those children. And what I like to tell people is that our task as parents, whether we are giving birth to those children or adopting them, is to start to let go. The minute we enter into the role of being a parent, that gradual process of giving our child independence and competence is that gradual process of letting go. And sometimes it's hard because adoptive parents tend to be a lot more clingy And I find that a lot of that clinginess has to do with their own insecurity about truly being the parents, and therefore you hang on to that which feels insecure. And so helping them understand identify the issues that may have to do with that for them.
Now, how do these people come to you, though?
I'm in the phone book. I get referrals.
How do they know that they need to hear? I mean, they're coming to you under what guidance?
I do pre-adoptive counseling to help them understand adoption so that they can more clearly look at what the complexities of adoption are.
Individualized or group?
I'm doing individualized, just a couple at this point. It's just time constraints. I'm not doing regular groups. My practice is fairly part-time at this point, and that's all I want because my kids are little.
So they're coming to you electively.
Oh yeah, right,
See,
right.
The problem I'm having, and I don't want to intrude on your time, Kimmy, but they're coming to me for one purpose.
Uh-huh.
And I want to make sure they're also hearing about this other purpose because I'm committed to that part,
Absolutely.
And it's a real dilemma. I mean, the blinds get
That's right.
drawn.
That's
and
right.
I can, more of them are getting it, more of them are open to it, and maybe that's because I'm more forceful and confident now in the way I present it. But there are still some who just will not hear this.
Well,
They come to me for
sure,
purposes.
sure. And see, people may come to me for 1 hour. I'm not offering 25 hours of education necessarily. They may continue coming to me, but I may only have them for an hour. And I feel it's very vital to bring out the key adoption issues within that hour. I prioritize what I feel I need to say to them, and because I need to reality base them. And with some, I may only be able to plant a seed. With some, they may discount everything I say, but the day will come when all of this will burst forth for them. And so that's all you can do. Now, when I was working at the agency, we did pre-adoptive counseling, which was part of the screening process, but it was also a service to the community in terms of helping them explore adoption at its initial steps. So no matter what agency they went to, they had a 1.5 hour, 2 hour session where they explored more adoption issues than they ever imagined existed. And so if they then continued with the agency, then they got tremendous focused education, and that was part of the program. But my feeling is that sometimes all you can do is plant a seed and open a door, and that there are a tremendous number of resources out there that if these people ever avail themselves of, you have gotten them going in the right direction. And we don't have control over everything, and that's all there is to it. Some of my search-related counseling may be a 5-minute conversation. When I am working with resistant adoptive parents who want no part of search, that may be all I have. So I prioritize what I'm going to say to them in those 5 minutes, and I am listening very carefully to what they're saying for what I feel that I can say. And they're going to hear some of it, and they're not going to hear some of it. And that's all you can do. So we don't always have the luxury of 20 hours of counseling with people, and that's just a reality.
The time would make all that much difference.
Well, and and sometimes it's just planting that seed, putting in some new thoughts in their heads. A lot of what I do in terms of working with adoptive parents is that I start trying to help them get in touch with their own issues. What brought you to adoption? What were your fantasies? What have the realities been? What's it been like with your child? What have you noticed? What kind of information did you get when your child came to you? What kind of information do you wish you had? To try to make it non-threatening and be gathering information that gets them processing their own adoption experience. Certainly infertility becomes a very major issue. How did you know that you were ready to adopt? What were the issues for you prior to that? How was it when you weren't getting pregnant? Did you cry? Do you cry now when you have a friend? Here you're an adoptive parent and your child's 15. Do you cry when you hear that your friend is pregnant and having a shower? So that you start getting a measure. When your child asks questions about his birth family, how does that feel to you? Sometimes parents cry because it's emotional, not because they want to close off communication. I encourage them to label their feelings for their children. I have lots of friends who are very emotional and lots of clients who are very emotional, and it's not that they don't want to talk with their kids about adoption, it's that they feel a tremendous amount of emotion. And my encouragement to them is label those feelings, communicate with your children clearly, because all too early adopted kids start closing off communication by verbal and nonverbal signals. And therefore it's very vital that communication in the family remain open about adoption, that adoption always be okay. And then there are those parents that say, but my kids never have any questions. And you have to penetrate that fantasy and help them understand that children have a million questions that they don't always feel free to ask. And how do we help them bring about communication? You buy books and put them on the coffee table. You watch TV programs, and when adoption is a topic, you say, oh, do you wonder about your birth mom, or do you da-da-da-da? And so you are constantly bringing up opportunities without overkill. It's that balance. As I tell my kids about anything we do in our family, everything in moderation. Doesn't matter what it is, everything in moderation. And it's the same thing with adoption communication, that children know that no matter what, that there's an opportunity to talk about it. And as we all know, kids bring up topics at very unexpected times, be it sex or be it adoption. And therefore, there may be times when we may have to say to them, I don't have an answer right now. Let me think about it for a moment. That's okay. There's nothing incompetent about saying, I need to think about it. But to always let those kids know that it's okay to talk about it. And to let, a lot of the work that I do involves validating the parents as the parents, because again, entitlement issues are so central to whether they're going to feel secure or insecure about being parents. And so a tremendous amount of time is spent on saying, you are those children's parents. You have to demonstrate to them your security in the relationship. Because if you're insecure in the relationship, what does that mean to them? It's not a secure relationship. Birth parents bestow us with entitlement. Their greatest dream is that our children are happy and loved by us, that our children feel a part of our family. If we're not sure that we're connected to these kids, those kids are going to pick it up. So we have to work on our own feelings of entitlement, and that involves working through feelings about infertility and our own worthwhileness about being parents. How many people do you see who attack their self-esteem all the time because they couldn't get pregnant? I know a woman who committed suicide. I know it's suicide because I knew her well enough, who always felt unworthy because she could not bear children in her culture. That was totally unacceptable. And that's the extreme of that feeling lack of self-esteem, but it's very much present in our society. And how do we keep validating these parents? And the only way that I feel that they can do that is for them to bestow that to themselves by understanding that birth parents bestow it unto them and that their children desperately need it. And that hopefully then they can start feeling it. And if they can be at peace with the fact that they didn't give birth to this child, but that nonetheless they're connected, our kids' greatest fear is that they would lose us. That is their greatest fear, no matter what their fantasies are about birth parents, no matter how much they say, I wish I could live with so-and-so. These so-and-sos are not familiar to them. And even in open adoption, where contact is maintained.
When they're not like so-and-so.
But see, even in open adoption, just think about people. See, as an adoptive parent, another major issue that we do with our kids, whether we're involved with adoption or not, is we give our children permission to love. Because love is possible with vast numbers of people. There's no limit to how many people any of us can love. So we say to our children, you can love me, and you can love daddy, and you can love grandma and grandpa. It's really important in adoption to give our kids permission to love their birth parents, because that's all a statement about themselves too. Their birth parents are lovable, they're lovable, it's all that extension of self. And if we can demonstrate to our children that we love their birth parents, that's even a major sign of acceptance of that love for that birth parent. So it's that ongoing cycle of showing both actions and behaviors in terms of loving. And so let us say that you have a neighbor that you're very fond of and that your children are very fond of. Your children may love to go visit the neighbor, but it doesn't mean they want to live there. And invariably they go back to mom and dad because that's home. Even the kids that run away when they're 15 and 16 years old, they're checking out their independence and they're doing their own thing. But they're not looking for another set of parents to take care of them. Mom and dad are their unit, for good or for bad. So even when the birth parents are known, they're not going over there to live with them as a more desirable couple. It's that nurturing, that daily nurturing that defines the parents. So again, as part of the whole process of helping prepare adoptive parents for the search, or the possible search, or whatever it is in terms of contact, I find that it's very vital to bestow upon them the right to be parents to these children, to teach them that they have to give their children permission to love, because in so doing these children are nurturing themselves and they're really feeding the well-being of their children in the process. Hi there. Welcome.
Thank you.
And so that is part of that process of understanding self and others, helping them understand. I go a lot into the mythology about birth parents because there's still a tremendous amount of mythology about birth parents that don't want to be approached. And we have to help them get in touch with what that really means. What do you think that really means when birth parents say, but I don't want my children to intrude on that birth parent? What do you think that's really all about?
You're talking about with an adoptee who is older?
An adoptee of any age who is saying, maybe expressing a need to connect with birth family, and the parents are saying, we don't want to intrude on your birth parents. Your birth parents have a new life. You always hear this, new life.
Well, if it's coming from the adoptee, I think the adoptee probably has a fear that they'd be hurting the adoptive parents.
Mm-hmm.
If it's coming from the adoptive parents, depends on in what context it was brought up originally. There has to be some impetus for, obviously their own fears would have some part to it.
Absolutely.
But the media and the limit, you're much more immersed in this.
Right.
I mean, the media still does portray situations where, and there's books too that says the birth families did not want to be. There's people here who will tell you stories about it. So I guess I'm thinking of that as not an open adoption having been from the onset, which is obviously a much cleaner and probably more.
What I find real typically is that there's a tremendous protection of self anytime that there's that kind of statement about you're going to hurt so-and-so out there. That there is a lot of protection of self. There are concerns. I think that there are genuine, conscious concerns about the other party, but probably at a much deeper level and at a greater intensity is the fear of one's own hurt. What are you hoping to gain from our little round table here?
Well, I'm a family therapist, and I've taken upon myself with Ken Watson to do some educating of therapists
Good.
around adoption issues. And since one of the things that certainly would happen if an adoptive family came for help was around adolescent kids, and it's a very typical time that these families will come. And search and identity issues are very relevant. So I'm just going to see what other folks were saying about this.
Okay, all righty, great. We're doing it rather informally because there's just so few of us, and basically I plan to do it this way anyway, to have input in any way. We're just talking initially about working with the adoptive parents in terms of getting them in touch and aware of their own issues and validating them as parents. In adoption, and not just in adoption circles, but in the community at large, we still hear a lot about the vocabulary of the real parents. And I really get into that with people. I think Marietta Spencer did us a service in terms of heightening our awareness of adoption vocabulary. And each one of us determines which vocabulary is comfortable for us. But what I say to parents is that we're all real, and therefore we don't need to use that vocabulary. The birth parents are real, you're real, And each one of us just has a different role in the life of these children. We're the active parents, if you like, in terms of the day in, day out parenting role, and the birth parents are not participating in that fashion. But we don't have to sit there and figure out who's more real, because we're not in competition. We each have a different role in these children's lives. And to again help validate them and the special connection that they have to their children, and that this is a lifetime role, whether their relationship is good or bad. Sometimes, particularly during bad times, they feel so threatened in the permanence of that relationship. And in the vast majority of cases, these adopted individuals will journey through the developmental stages and redefine in adulthood, whether they have completed searches or not, they will redefine in adulthood a more adult relationship with their parents, like everybody else does. If they complete their searches, they redefine in an even better way, in that the bonds become even tighter. But again, it's just helping parents understand that they are permanent objects in the lives of these kids who later become adults. And that validation is just an ongoing process in working with parents, because I see so much insecurity. And bestowing that to them so they learn to bestow it upon themselves. One of the rules that I tell people about in our home is that I will not allow my kids to beat up on themselves. You know, I'm stupid, I'm dumb, I'm clumsy. That's not allowed in our family. There's too much beating up of oneself out in our society, and there are others that too often are eager to beat up on us. And so we have to teach adoptive parents to bestow entitlement upon themselves and the right to be that role in those children's lives. And then we were starting to talk about birth parents and helping adoptive parents understand that some of the fears that they are speaking about with regard to being intrusive, or with regard to birth parents not being open to contact, to help them get to the point of understanding, which I find most frequently is the case, that it's their fear of losing the relationship with their children. And again, entitlement and infertility revisited. And to help them understand that the reality is that most birth parents are open to contact. And in my experience, the percentages are over 95%. And this is even in cases of special needs adoptions where the kids have been forcibly removed, where there's been abandonment and all kinds of abuse.
At any stage of trying to reopen a relationship, not just from an open situation.
That's right. That's right. I have made contact with birth parents who had been raped. I have made contact. Last year, I made contact with a birth mom who gave birth to her child in prison. I found her back in jail. Overjoyed to be contacted, very grateful. And in fact, in working with birth parents, what I try to help adoptive parents understand is that birth parents are so grateful to have access to the children, and that they're not trying to regain custody of the children, because that's what's so scary, the permanence of the relationship. And to help parents understand that while birth parents want to be acknowledged within the life of that child and integrated when it's possible, that they are not seeking to oust them as the parents of the children. In all the years I've been doing this, there have been a very minimal percentage of birth parents who dreamed and had fantasies of being mom. And as time passed, they were able to work that out as well. In other words, they're not insurmountable difficulties.
Would you say that there's been a substantial percentage of, after the fact, we're not talking about initially, but situations that have been opened up later on, where they have become abusive in terms of, this has been so exciting to now be in a relationship that they were deprived of or not involved in for whatever number of years, that it becomes too much then for the adoptee and or the adoptive family? I know it can work both ways, but my question
right.
is from the birth mother.
The definition of the relationship when contact is made after there's been a break in contact for X number of years really takes years to define. And so there are times when it feels too intense and people pull back. So a lot of my, again, because in adoption we tend to, as I call it, pathologize so much. When I am doing searching with people, I do what I call a prep session. It's a counseling session. I don't call it counseling because I don't want them to think that there's anything pathological about it. Too often my callers are so apologetic and so insecure about responding to their own need to act on a search or to explore a search that, again, I spend so much time giving permission and validating their needs. I do this with all three parties. And therefore, I don't call it counseling. I tell them I do a prep session for people that are thinking about searching to explore what the issues are and the complexities. And again, at that point, they're considering these issues in the abstract to some extent because they're not already immersed in their own search. They may be aware of others, but they're not immersed in their own situation. And then I call the after the search has been completed stage processing, which is counseling, but I call it processing of what's going on. And what I say to them is that there will be times when one or the other party or both will just want to talk with me about what's going on and what they're feeling. And the two rules of thumb that I express to them is there has to be a respect of boundaries. You are coming together after a multitude of years of separation. So even though you have that genetic connection, that is not enough to make the relationship go in a long-term kind of way. It gives you a major head start, but it's not enough. And therefore, it's very vitally important to communicate clearly, as in any other life situation. And many of us do not have very good communication skills. And so I say to them, communicate clearly, not hurtfully. Be sensitive to each other, but communicate clearly what your needs are, because there will be times when one or the other party has greater needs and is more aggressive in expressing those needs. And so yes, I have had parties who have said, back off, I need some quiet time. And then to help that other party know that time is needed to process. And obviously as time, again, because control issues are so major in adoption, you want to give, whether you're working with the adoptive parents, the birth parents, or the adoptees, some self-determination controls. And so I phase out of the process very quickly, really, after a search is completed.
That was one of my
But I
questions.
remain available.
Party is really important at the beginning.
Well, again, because of control issues, I don't mandate anything. I am available. When I am working with agency files, I have to be the go-between. When I access court records, I don't have to be the go-between. But I feel that any time I am involved, then I have a responsibility, whether I'm making the contact or not, to at least prepare the requesting party, whichever party it is. I don't care which party it is. So my definition of my role is to do some preparation. I may not be involved for the processing stages down the road, even though I remain available. But I try to be real cognizant of control issues with whichever party I'm talking about, so that I'm not hitting people over the head, kind of like what you were saying about we have to really be aware of that. Because all three parties in adoption are so deeply touched by control issues. You look at the infertility issues of adoptive parents, the American dream, I'm going to grow up, get married, and have a baby. And it doesn't happen. And then your whole life is tied up in the technology of infertility. And then when you make the adoption decision, your whole life is locked up in the availability of which system you get into for adoption purposes. So being in control is really a major issue. And it's important to turn that over as quickly as one can. So there are lots of people that do their entire searches and may come to me after the fact just because they need to process what's going on, the emotional dimensions. I use, in terms of guiding people through the search process, an excellent book for that is The Search Aftermath and Adjustment. It very easily covers so many of the topics that arise in the search process. And I have a copy here somewhere, and I'm sure they sell it in the bookstore. But the reason I like it is that it's short, it's maybe 45 pages, just a little booklet, it's cheap, and people can easily read it. And while a lot of times people will not believe you when you say these are the issues that will be confronted, as they're experiencing it, they can go back into what they read and know that they're normal. Again, the validation process. I get people a lot who apologize for what is totally normal. So I use much of that, I expand on it, but a lot of that content has been very consistently. It's a very on Target Book. One example that we deal with in talking about searching is what you may have heard in this area of the genetic sexual attraction. When you're dealing with people separated by adoption who are of the opposite sex typically. It may be a birth mother and her son, it may be siblings, it may be a birth father and his daughter. To make people cognizant of the issue that here you have people who have not been together for a multitude of years. They have emotional linkages to one another. They may want to express their emotional linkage by a hug, by a kiss, or whatever, but because they have no previous history, it may take on a sexual connotation, and it can be very frightening. So again, to help them protect themselves by setting up appropriate boundaries, and more than anything, to be aware, so they're not setting themselves up for something that could be emotionally devastating and really devastate their relationship. So again, it's that preparation to plant seeds so that people become aware. But I get a lot of people say, not me, not my case. Okay, so in working again with adoptive parents, we are looking at the parents that right now that are open to talking about this to whatever extent they're willing to do it, and we're teaching them how to communicate within their families so that as they look toward the possibility that someday their children will have contact with family, there has been some really good laying of groundwork. We have to help them understand too that while cognitively they may be saying to their children, I'm really okay with you seeking out your birth family whenever the time is right, that emotionally they may have some very conflicting feelings. And we see that a lot. There's a clash between the intellect and the emotions. And that they get in touch with that so they can be true to themselves as well and be able to speak about their fears, because typically what's connected to that, the discomfort, is the fear issue, again, of losing their children, of their children being hurt, of any number of things that tie into that fear. And so, for example, I talked with a girl a couple of weeks ago, and she said that many years ago, about 5 years ago, their agency was sending out letters to adoptive parents, making the parents aware of the fact that we had new learning in adoption, and that there were a lot of birth parents coming forward asking about the welfare of their children, and that this agency wanted to be able to have something available for them when they did this. And so a really nice proportion of adoptive parents sent in letters and pictures and things like that for sharing, very obviously, with the birth parents. Well, in this girl's case, she was very excited by this letter from the agency, and she said she filled out the update form that was enclosed and put it in the mailbox, that her parents had always told her that whenever she was ready to search, they would be there to help her. She put it in the mailbox, whereupon her mother ripped it up and threw it away. So here you had what would seem to me a conflict between the cognitive position and the emotional, or at least the what I say and what I do position. And she got a very clear message from her mother that this truly was not all right. And so what was she doing instead? She was coming to me and saying, do you tell parents when kids are searching? And of course not. And it's real vital for adoptive parents to understand why we don't tell them when their kids are searching if they are adults. Obviously, if they're minors, we have to involve them out of, I think, ethical and legal reasons. But once they are adults, we have to help adoptive parents understand that, like other human beings in our society, adults have a right to full self-determination and to privacy issues. I think as human beings we have privacy issues. We do not have to tell everybody everything that we do or feel or think. And particularly in adoption, the child status is a forever kind of status. And so we have to help the parents understand that these adoptees do have to grow up and do have to reach a level of feeling adult and therefore have the right to determination. We have to help them understand what the issues are for the adopted person. Why is the adopted person searching? What is that issue all about? Well, what is the belief in the heart of these adoptive parents? What is the belief? What have you experienced the belief to be? My child is searching because?
They're not happy with me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I am not enough. I am not enough. And it's real difficult for them to get beyond that. And the learning, we're going to pause, keep talking. I'm not very photogenic. Take a picture of the other people. we have to help them understand that when adults or children are searching for birth family, they are not searching for parents in the sense of I'm looking for a mommy. Now for some there is a certain level of that. There are times when perhaps they have a fantasy of what that mommy's going to be about. And sometimes that's very difficult for them to express as well. But the reality is that when we are adults, we are not looking for a mommy or a daddy. What we are looking for is ourself. And a lot of times adoptees will say, I am doing a search, I need to know my birth mother, or whatever the issue is. But in the final analysis, when the search is completed, they are able to verbalize the fact that what they are in fact doing and have accomplished is a search for self. And that's a fairly dramatic existential statement for anyone to make. The typical questions that adopted people will have, and like I say, that was the script that was so dramatic to me, is that they will say, I need to know who I look like. And truly that is, I need to know who I look like in physical terms. Look at the symbolic kinds of things that happen in our society when a baby is born. The minute a baby is born, the whole kid gets taken apart. He has mom's eyes, dad's nose, grandma's hair, and on and on. It's a symbolic way that we make that child. That's right, and that is a symbolic way that that child gets brought into the family. And when you're adopted, you don't have that. So in fact, the physical attributes are definite issues that adoptees are seeking for, but there's a much deeper need of existential connection. And that is the script. Who do I look like? And we need to look below the surface. And in this entire adoption field, we have to look below the surface because a lot of the typical statements are protected statements. Kind of like what we said before. I'm afraid my child's going to get hurt because the birth mother's not available. We have to get them below that issue into the other side of that statement. And that's why we have to be so closely in touch with what the issues are in order to help them get there. The other question of, I need to know why I was adopted. And my experience has been that they truly need to know the facts, the data. They want to know all the details. But the below the surface issue is, was I loved or rejected? Because rejection reigns supreme in the hearts of adopted persons. And whether they are expressing it or not, the feelings of abandonment are there. They're just there. And the did you want to say something?
Yeah, the other thing that I've been more and more aware of is that you can't always make generalizations either, because adoptees and adoptive families come in such a scope of are also those adoptees who really had a pretty dreadful experience in their adopted family, and I think for some of them there really is the wish of, if I got, or the fantasy sometimes, or often maybe, that if I just could have stayed with my birth family, everything would have been much better. You know, the lost princess, prince,
Absolutely.
thing. But I think that what the experience in the adoptive family is going to condition some of the attitudes towards search. Even though I think the basic need to do it is normal and there for everybody, probably.
Well, that becomes a double whammy when there's abuse within the adoptive family or other major issues, be it divorce, death of an adoptive parent, whatever the issue is, it just adds issues onto that person's experience. And let's face it, there are very few fairy tale families in our society.
That's right.
And something that when I started doing my post-adoption work, I would talk with adopted individuals about their relationship with their parents, just so that I get into, I was learning and I was starved for learning, and I would just ask all kinds of questions to start gathering this understanding. And I would have adopted people that would say to me that they never felt close to their parents, and that basically the gist of the message was that their parents really handled adoption in a fairly lousy way, and that they never really felt a part of that family. What I came to learn as time went by, that we have to help adoptive parents understand, because it's all part of this process, is that our children have experienced loss. And I am a strong believer in that loss experience going all the way back to infancy. And that this is at their very core. And that when you have that kind of loss of prime human beings in your existence, that trusting is so difficult. And when you can't trust, you can't have intimacy. And so what I discovered as I got more immersed in this adoption experience is that adopted people start building walls around themselves. That it's not all the adoptive parents' wrongdoings, but that as products of their experience, that this isolation starts coming about with significant people in their lives, their own parents, sometimes in friendships, sometimes in just any other kind of intimate relationship, that just have a tremendously difficult time building bonds of trust, which lead to intimacy. And my discovery went on that as people completed their searches, that contrary to the typical fears of adoptive parents of losing their children, that in fact the magnificent outcome was that there was an existential redefinition. That feeling of wholeness, because what is the vocabulary that adopted people use consistently? Consistently, I feel whole, the puzzle piece is missing. The vocabulary is incredibly rich in terms of conveying what it's all about. And what happens in that redefinition is that as they come to learn that the adoption happened, not out of rejection, but out of love and caring, and that birth family continued to think about him or her and remember them and have love for them, that wellness starts happening. There is healing. Now, I have to tell you that healing is an overtime process. The search does not take care of everything immediately or even ever. But there's a tremendous amount of healing that starts taking place at the core of that person. And as that person redefines self, what happens then is that they can start building intimate bonds at a greater level of strength. And so what happens is that they truly become closer to their parents. And it's dramatic to observe that, because whether I worked with people who were close to their parents or had fallouts with their parents, the outcome after the fact was a feeling of closeness to that adoptive family, and a redefinition and a working through of a multitude of fantasies about that birth family. Now, that is not a denial of the birth family, but it's a relocating of where that birth family fits in a more real world.
Can you talk more about I've read a lot about the loss even to an infant.
I am a strong believer, and I don't have all the scientific data, but just in terms of working with children and talking a lot even with foster parents who experience infants who are going into adoption, where they are witnessing the grief of those babies. I feel very strongly that the in utero experience of infants, which is an experience typically of crises, that this is carried on for them throughout their lifetimes, that the separation from those birth moms and then onto their adoptive parents impacts our children very dramatically. And I get kind of far out on this stuff because I feel so strongly about it, even though I don't have a whole lot of scientific basis. I've been doing a lot of reading, and I'm trying to gather data that's considered really scientific data, because I feel that our children carry these hurts within them. And we see it even in infants who may cry or be fussy or pull away from parents. And we will have all kinds of different contributing factors in terms of how those children finally process all of this. There are children that will settle in and attach in a more successful way than others. But I feel that in adoption we truly have to pay attention to help our babies while they're in utero. And what that means is we have to help those birth moms. We have to help those birth moms to work on their crisis while they're pregnant, to talk to their babies and convey loving messages, because we connect in so many ways. It's not just the emotional and the physiological, but all the different workings within our system. That those babies are receiving nurturing messages in utero, because even in crisis, as birth mothers can do that. And they need to know how critical they are to these babies' welfare for the entire life. And that's why we as adoptive parents have to become so aware of that connection, that we are truly all very connected and that we truly all need each other. And part of that is conveying to birth parents that we need them in our kids' lives for our children's welfare and therefore for our family's welfare. That maybe some of these kids in treatment centers could be out of those treatment centers if all along the way they were getting communication that their birth parents remembered them and loved them, and that when these children had questions that needed to be answered, like other children in the world, they had access to those answers and those people, rather than creating these incredible walls and mystery about the needs that these kids have, because what happens in fact then is that these children fixate and it starts eating at them and it becomes like an ulcer.
What about the birth families that do not participate or that start waning in their participation?
And that is a major problem because it's out there, and that's where we have to have that ongoing staying with it because they don't get it. I work extensively with birth parents, and they don't understand how necessary they are because their fantasy is that their child is in good hands with loving parents, especially when they're in open adoption. They get that confirmation. These parents love my child is healthy, my child is fine, they know I love them. I'm really not needed anymore. And they're very self-effacing. We have to help them move from that self-effacing position to learning that they really are critical in those children's lives. And sometimes it just takes a tremendous amount of persistence. And we've experienced it in our own family. My daughter needed to meet her birth mother since she was about 4 or 5. Her birth mother could not cope with it. Couldn't do it.
What told you she needed to? She verbally?
Her behavior and her behavior definitely, and her words very early on. And sometimes she's a particularly bright child, and I think that sometimes kids that are very bright start processing earlier cognitively than they can handle emotionally, and it compounds, I think, the complexity of the issues. And so she needed to be responded to years ago. And the birth mom would write intermittently. She would stay in touch intermittently, not fully comprehending the depth of this kid's need. This is a very intense child. We finally met her just a few weeks ago. My child is 11 and a half. But there's a tremendous amount of anger that has gotten compounded as a result for having to wait. So, your complexities abound, but it's an incremental working out of issues. I guess that's the beauty of open adoption, is it allows us to incrementally work out our issues. And they're complex and they take time. But when you're talking about these long-term searches where people are now 20 and 30 years old, you're dealing with issues that have so many layers that it takes a lot longer to start working them out. And that's a major difference, I feel. Whereas when we're doing it with younger kids, and people often will say, we don't think it's sound to do searches on behalf of minors. Well, I disagree, because what you're doing instead is you're allowing those minors to fixate on issues that they don't need to expend so much energy on. We see a tremendous amount of energy being expended on all kinds of issues related to adoption that could have been taken care of years ago if the philosophy and the workings were different. It's not a cure-all. I want to emphasize that. Open adoption is not a cure-all. Searching is not a cure-all. Any of these things, because we're dealing with a very complex human emotion. Multiple human emotions. But these are interventions. See, to me, the search is a basic therapeutic intervention. That's why I get very distressed when I hear that all these post-adoption programs are set up to do counseling. Well, you can counsel. Sure, you can do a lot of gestalt here, talk to your birth mother, beat up on her. But my God, there's no comparison to having that person in the flesh and blood to be able to work out that stuff. Are you seeing some interventions on behalf of your kids in treatment that are search-related?
There's very little searching actually going on, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really have that to work with.
Mm-hmm.
What I would comment on what you were just talking about is that it's, when you say it's not a solution, it's not a solution, but it's healthy.
Absolutely.
I think that's the major difference. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
because of, and earlier you said it was real, it's
Mm-hmm.
real.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in the example that you were thinking about, like, so the birth parents start to wane in their interest. But that's an actual reality that everybody knows, that actually is happening. She stopped calling, as opposed to what's always been just a fantasy, is this person even
Mhm.
alive?
If a
Or-
6, 7, 8-year-old and she's waning in her interest and her acknowledgement and her participation, like you say, it's not perfect, but I guess I would feel more comfortable if there was a great amount of data, of which there's not because of the time issues of how long this has been going on, and of how many families would participate in studies. We always have that problem and issue of kids who were in those ages and just beginning in latency, and kids who are pre-adolescent, and all these, every age has its own.
What I'm finding, I've been doing this for 9.5 years, and very quickly, again, in our post-adoption program, I was not just doing searching for adults, but immediately. Actually, some of my searching started as a self-serving thing in that because I was working at the agency and my daughter's birth mother was not in touch with us, I had a hunger for contact and understanding, and I started reaching out to women who were now birth parents through our agency, just see how they were doing. And as a result, what evolved was that families got wind of what I was doing, and they said, hey, would you reach out to our birth mother? And so my immersion has been very thorough in terms of the different ages where contact became facilitated. And what I found was weaning is probably not a word I would use. I find that birth parents have so many issues that they deal with that sometimes they have to work through their own grief issues. And not all of them are doing all that work. And therefore they get stuck. And some get stucker than others. So my encouragement to adoptive parents was always, whether your birth mother writes you back or not, if you feel comfortable in your heart to do that, because you know that it's right, then do it. And keep doing it, and keep doing it, because the day will come when that birth mother will be able to reach a point of responding, because those letters are incredibly difficult to write. I know it because I was the intermediary for just a vast number on either side. And where it was hard for the adoptive parents, it was even harder for the birth mother. She had so many concerns. She wants her child to know that the child is loved. She wants the adoptive parents to accept her and love her, because if they do, then she has a higher likelihood of them conveying to those children a positive image of her. She wants to say just the right perfect words. And what I would say to her, I've been doing this for years, and there are very few letters that I have ever said, this is my reaction to your letter because there's something there that doesn't feel right to me. For example, very occasionally there would be a birth mom that would sign her name, your mom. And I said, we're dealing with a 4 or 5-year-old. That could be confusing for a 4 or 5-year-old. A child who's older will deal with it a little differently. But for a little kid, that might be a little hard. You might want to consider birth mom and then your name, because that's what a lot of the kids will say, this is my birth mom, da-da. And that seems to work for kids. My daughter's 9.5. She periodically will call her birth mother her mom, and that's okay. See, part of this whole process is giving our kids permission to do what they need to do. Some of it, and again, with children, parents have to understand that they're checking us out all the time. Whether we gave birth to them or not, they're checking out all kinds of parameters. So in adoption, your kid will say to you, you're not my real mother. Well, in our book, I tell the anecdote of how, I remember one day, my older one, who's my more fiery one, standing outside of the door of our house that the whole world could hear it, was yelling and screaming, you're not my real mother, you can't tell me what to do. And she was this wild frenzy. My mother was horrified. My mother is very protective of my role with my children. And I stood there and I said, I am your real mother, and I will tell you what to do. Well, we went through this cycle with both kids where they would take turns, and my comment always was, I tell them I'm not in competition with their birth mothers, we're all real. That's my usual vocabulary. And I don't care what you want or do, this is what you got to do. Well, it got to the point where they would say to each other when this was going on, she is your real mother and she can tell you what to do. But what they're checking out is the permanence of our relationship and to see if they can get me going. Well, they couldn't. They weren't going to. And so they were able to move through that. So we have to help parents know that that we have to look beyond. Again, not only do we help that individual know his own statements and the underlying statements, but they have to start getting an understanding of what the other parties are saying and what the underlying statements are there, so that it's not so scary. Because when you understand it, then you can deal with it a whole lot better, and you can get beyond the emotions of the moment.
The scary part is really significant in terms of, I hear some of your earlier questions, like, just with the overall importance of the word adoption, to be a comfortable word in families.
That's right.
The visiting, the going to see, the contact. If the adoptive parents are really nervous about that, then I think there's still work to be done in terms of sharing that nervousness. Some of the parallels that I use with a family now relate to issues in divorced families where the kids first start to go on a regular basis to the other parent. They're very parallel, similar kind of fears, and where it's not handled well. And family therapy sessions after a while come back, finally the kids talk about how they hate to come home to their home. they're not talking about hate to return to home. They can't stand the pain
Mm-hmm.
that they see in their mom usually, who can't share. It took a year for this mom to finally be able to say, "Did you have a good time?" I mean, she was so worried that the answer would be yes to that, you know. So I use that just as an example of one of the significant parallel things. Then I think that there are differences between the adoptive parents on so many things like this, about what are they really comfortable with, and what do they pass on or not about comfort to the kids. And I think that that's where I see the family therapy piece being so observationally important initially, and then to try to add to some of the process things that have to be adjusted. It's a trust issue. I work with a family right now where I see the boy individually and family. He's starting now, even in family, to talk about how he's not close to anybody. Fortunately, I have two. I wish I had taped. I don't use videotape enough, but I have 2 sessions, which at the right time, I think my trust is he won't be able to deny his closeness, because when he wasn't advocating for the mistrust, they do these nice things. This is a kid who's in placement, and their most real moments have been, unless we've had a big fight at the end, their most real moments seem to be when they're leaving. It's similar to siblings who stand there and tell you that they hate each other, whereas it's so obvious from the way someone else steps in, how they'll protect to the utmost.
That's right.
Well, you see this all the time. They actually have achieved real trust. That was one thing I wanted to comment on. But the walls that they need really prevent them from experiencing almost their own trust.
That's right.
That's a tremendous difficulty, I think, that has to be. Yeah, as a family therapist, I would see like the birth parents, where it's obviously isn't going to work in every situation, but it really is to be thought of as extended family. And I think that would be very useful. With legitimate, and I use the word control because I think parents have to be in charge. I think that people have to be in charge of. Your neighbor example, I thought was really useful. I think that when things are going well, your kids still play with the other kids or go to that family. When things aren't going well, they don't go right then until I would suggest that families call meetings. You know, not just end everything. You need to call a meeting. You have to you have to find out why is this, what's going wrong here. And it's not an easy answer, because I'm sure, unfortunately, there are going to be many, many families where where there's a lot of dysfunction and maybe severe things where. But that's on both sides, actually. You know, that's like you know, some of the adoptive families are like that too.
That's right. And even go beyond that. You don't let your kids go spend the night just at anybody's house, or even at relatives. I don't let my kids just go to even my relatives. You know, I pick and choose. Well,
This is like nothing else.
Well, but
There's other neighbors.
Uh-huh.
There's other relatives.
Well,
It's
and-
not another birth mom. It's just, you know, maybe it's my paranoia, the part that I'm stuck at, you know, I mean, I'm pretty sure it is, but.
what I have found is
But I think that's important, that you not start to label it like your paranoia. I think it's very real. And
Paranoia's
it's
not
more
real.
real now than at any other time, because it's all unknown. You know, you're really talking about an unknown in a similar way. So yes, is my daughter going to stay would I let my daughter stay at these birth parents that you're talking about? I don't know them. I'm not going to let her stay there right now. If you tried to convince me to do that, I'm not going to let you convince me. And why would I do that? I don't know them at all.
That's right.
Something has to happen to make me
That's
be
right.
willing to do that.
That's right.
So that
That's right. That's right. Building trust. And that's what it's about. And that's what the beauty of establishing a relationship while your children are young is so wonderful, because as adults then we build that trust and we build that relationship and we start making decisions about what we're okay with, just like we do with other people where maybe the emotional connection is not the same, but there are times when my kids are invited to a friend's house to spend the night, and maybe I know the parents, but I do some internal struggling of whether I want my kid to spend the night over there. And it is defined by how much I trust those people and their judgment and the way they live. And there's not the emotional connection, but the building of trust among the adults is a major issue. And so that starts defining for you what you're comfortable doing. And so you may want to have that contact yourself with that person to get that knowledge base going.
But it is. Trust is a major issue. Trust is and sometimes when I'm working with minors, what I encourage, because I feel adoptive parents are so central in this. See, as we convey to our kids our comfort with this, what ends up happening is a tighter bonding with our children. I just see it over and over and over. Whether you call it search or open adoption, whatever it is, it's a tighter bonding because what you're doing is you're letting your child have some parameters, movement freedom, and what happens is they really come back to you. I'll give you, I think, a dramatic example. My daughter, the 11-and-a-half-year-old, for years we have sent her birth mother a Mother's Day card. And I obviously finance it every year. She always likes the most expensive, most flowery big card she can find. And it's always to my dear mother, and she always writes a very flowery message and the whole bit. I have genuinely been very okay with that for years. I'm the one that invited her if she wanted to buy a Mother's Day card, you know? Well, she met her Easter Sunday. So Mother's Day was just a few weeks later. And so to both my children, I said, want to go buy your Mother's Day card? Let's go get them. We send them to Grandma's now, too. And when she got to the store this year, she said, but Mom, these all say Dear Mother and to Mother. She no longer, right now, wanted to buy her a Mother's Day card. She had had some redefinition and some working out. Now, it may be that 2 years from now she wants to send her a Dear Mother card again. And I don't care. I mean, it's okay with me. But what I'm saying to you, instead what she bought was a beautiful, thoughtful, kind of dear friend card. Even though we're apart, I think of you a lot. I love you a lot. It was a beautiful, beautiful card. But totally different message. So she was working on something this year that was different from other years. That's significant. That's a major emotional, psychological, existential process for this child. Like I say, she may want to get her Dear Mother card down the way, and that's okay. But the main thing that I wanted to know is that I'm okay with whatever she picks out. That's my letting go. But in the process, what happens is that she comes back to me even more so. After we met her birth mother, it was, oh, Mommy, I love you so much. And you know, you can love me, you can love her, you can love whoever you want. I'm okay with that.
No, I think it's that openness. It's also the care of saying, I'm not going to let you do things unless I know it's safe for you. And it's also, I heard Ken Watson talk to a group of adoptive parents a few months ago, in which he made a very moving discussion of how grieving openly together with the child about the pain of the situation. Ironically, if you cry together over how tough it is to have another mother out there that you don't know or whatever, that too bonds this relationship.
Absolutely.
Because the child's bringing his or her pain to you, and you're the one who's there.
As long as it doesn't like guilt. It has to be honest grieving, I wouldn't think.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I would absolutely 100% back you on that.
No, but if a child is crying about this, that comforts the child.
I thought you meant the parents crying.
Well,
the parent sharing in the child's pain and comforting the child and joining with it strengthens the bond between that parent and child, even if the tears are about some other parent out there.
Absolutely. You're very much on target.
That
It's
was from Ken.
very, very dramatic, and it's very true because the mourning in our children starts very early. And what I have discovered, again, that's part of teaching the parents to recognize the signs. Displaced anger. How typical is displaced anger in adoption? It is ever present within a multitude of our children. And who gets the bulk of it? Mom! To help us understand that it isn't that our kids just beating up on us for the fun of beating up on us, but that it's a part of that displaced anger which has to do with his grief. There are other children that grieve much more obviously. I have one of each. I have one where I've been beat up upon for years in the form of displaced anger. And I have another one who grieves very clearly in a grieving way. And so again, to recognize the different signs of grieving so that we can validate our children and give them a permission to do that which they need to do, it's very bonding as well, because you are sharing in that. We find that with children, sometimes they will say, I'm not adopted. I was not adopted. When my daughter was 5.5, that's what she did. She wasn't adopted. She did not grow in Gloria's womb. That was her thing. Well, and we have been telling her for a long time, obviously. As immersed as I am in the field, I missed it for a while. And then my light bulb went off, and I remembered an adoptive mom who had said to me that her children had gone through the stage of wishing that they had grown within her body. And here I was, yes, Jennifer, remember you were born in Gloria's womb, da, da, da. And then finally the click, and she's very tiny, so I bent down to her. I said, Jennifer, you've been talking a lot about the fact that you did not grow in Gloria's womb. Is what you're saying that you wish you had grown in my womb? And this very tender, effusive little kid, of course, that's what it was. And the beauty of it was that it was an emotional moment of tremendous bonding. And I said, well, I wish you had grown in my womb too. And it didn't happen, and I'm okay with that. But at least it was expressed. A few days later, she was back to growing in Gloria's womb. She had worked through that stuff. So again, I very much, and we've even had the bonding with the kids in grief, because one daughter was getting intermittent presents from her birth mother, and not the other. And that's real painful. And we have to really do a lot of communicating with those birth parents to help them understand that it's very painful for the children. And the little one was just falling apart, and the old one said, she took her on her lap, and this is one where I hate you all the time. I mean, I hate you all the time. And took her on her lap and told her that she was going to write her birth mother and ask her to make her something as well. And Gloria loves you very much. She just isn't able to send you a present. And I mean, you talk out of a major grief experience, a tenderness that evolved. So yes, it's sharing. And I think it's not just limited to adoption. It's anywhere where you are sharing an intimate moment with someone that it brings about that increased bonding. And so it's very, very, again, we as adoptive parents have to start understanding these various angles so that we don't feel so threatened, and that we can feel free to be in our role. Because a lot of what happens in adoption, unfortunately, is that we block ourselves as adoptive parents because of our own issues. And if we can get in touch with those issues and move beyond them, we will feel, again, that entitlement to be parents, that wellness about the fact that adoption is a fact in our lives, and communicate that comfort to our children. So it really does start with us. Our kids have so much baggage to deal with already that if we can help lighten that baggage some by conveying our own comfort, and that's why we say you start talking about adoption with your kids when they're infants. And a lot of that is just practice for us as adults. And we're also communicating very dramatic messages that perhaps the language is not understood to the kids, but the emotions are, the handling, and so on. So it's that gradual building block process of helping the children know that we are truly okay with adoption, so that we can communicate about it, and that part of that adoption communication extends to our wellness about those birth parents, and that we do have love for those birth parents, and that yes, there will be times when that will be challenged because the kids will check us out to see if we really mean that, because they don't understand the legal system and the practice modes out there in our society. And there are times when we truly cannot facilitate a search for our kids because maybe the tools aren't there, or the information is not there, or whatever. But as long as we say to the kids, I will help you to the best of my ability, and it is okay for you to need this and want this, and we will do whatever is possible, and then do whatever is possible. That in itself can be very healing for that child in terms of what he's struggling with at that point in time. It's that validation. We all need validation.
It allows for all those private thoughts.
Uh-huh.
This one boy that I was seeing, who I think will eventually do a search, he would be in my office alone and tell me he was having a thought about his birth month. And for the first 4 months, I don't think he could last more than 15 minutes. He had to call one of his adoptive parents. He had to make a phone call, contact. He never told them what was going on. He was checking, when you're going to come to see me, or did I get something confused? He had to. He was so in such loyalty conflicts.
Yes.
It was horrible.
Yeah.
And then after a while, he was able to talk about that. It was even why he was doing that. He finally shared why he was doing that. And they, fortunately, very nicely started to validate a lot of things for him. And they both told him that they'd be right there. And you know, they actually had someone had told them. I don't know where they had heard that. Someone had told them that they should never, ever mention the birth parent until he does. So he never even got, you know, do you ever wonder, or watch a program, which was really good suggestions. After that, it was dramatically different.
Yeah. Yeah, just that permission
Just
to
that
communicate.
permission.
Yeah. Dirk Brown many years ago was talking about how birthday time, and we know that birthday time is very central for the adopted person, and even more dramatically so for the birth parents. And that, again, another vehicle for communication for our children is to say, I know your birth mom's thinking about you today. And sometimes those kids will say, how do you know? You don't know her. But again, we can say it with conviction because we can say, I know birth parents. I know all about birth parents. I may not know your birth mom, but I know all about birth parents. And I know she's thinking about you today. What an opening up of a very dramatic moment for that child. So again, these are the ways that we give them permission. And the loyalty issue is so central. How often do we hear adopted people say, I'm searching but don't tell my parents. I don't want my parents to know because I don't want to hurt them. What is that all about? What is that all about? What are the multifaceted issues for that person there? What has been your experience? Somebody?
Channel ABC filmed me on Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
A guy who was interviewing me for a show that's going to be on at the end of June here in Chicago, and he's an adoptee who swore up and down to me that he never, ever had any desire to search, and it's just never been an issue. And I didn't want to say anything. A couple of minutes went by, and he said, maybe, my feelings will change after I do the show, because the show was kind of thrown in my lap, Then a little while later he said, if my mother knew that I was doing this show on adoption, I would have guessed he was in his upper 20s. He said, I might as well not ever, go to her house again. And then he said, maybe I'll wait until after my mother dies before I would search. And I just...
He moved fast for
Yeah,
a couple of minutes, didn't he?
I think that he obviously had contemplated some of those things, whether he looked into any conscious level before. The one thing that seemed to be somewhat conscious was he said that he thought about it, but he decided he would wait, if ever, until his adopted mom was dead.
What my experience has been with that, again, the multifaceted angles of the statement, adopted people at the very depth, at the core of their being, feel that the relationship with their adoptive parents is precarious. Remember, adoptive parents often demonstrate this insecurity with entitlement. Well, adopted people experience insecurity with entitlement as well at a very dramatic level. And so the greatest fear, no matter what their age, because they have already lost a major component of their life, their whole entire birth family. So therefore, their greatest fear is losing this connection to adoptive family. So this whole thing of, I don't want to hurt my parents, they truly don't want to hurt their parents. And I think we have to take that surface statement as true. They don't want to hurt them, they don't want to upset them. But at a much deeper level, they're scared to death of losing them. And we have to help adoptive parents know that and understand that. Because through the years, they have to be communicating to the children the permanence of that relationship. That it can be checked out along the way so they can be validated in that relationship. But it's a terribly scary feeling. You talk about disconnection to the planet.
If you know that the way your adoptive family is organized around the grief issues that were there is to deny or even block or cut off if people challenge you too much, for some adoptees, I think that's a very real issue, given what the nature of their family is.
You're right.
Not all families are able to be, or so far are not being, as open and generous as you have been with your children.
Well,
I think that, at least when I've worked with some of these people, the same thing I do if young adults are addressing their parents about any kind of issue where they have to make an important visit home. If it's adoptive parents, I'm really quite careful with the person of, what do you think the response is going to be? What do you know about your family and what's been said? What do you think the response will be? And are you able to take it? Let's see what all the possible alternatives are, and if it's going to be painful, can you bear it?
In every case that I've had clients, and again, my clients are prospective adoptive parents who are also adoptees themselves, and there's been maybe 4 or 5, which I found a pretty high rate. None of those people have ever had an interest in search and have made the same comment as this
Mhm.
news guy, that, yeah, real strong, which sort of made great everything, and now I'm, you know, believe me,
Mhm.
it was very contrary.
Mhm.
And so, I again, as you're saying, you tread a little bit, you know, differently. You were not in here yet when I was telling you what my position is, but I'm teaching these people how to be successful at adoption. So here they are, going to be adoptive parents, they're adoptees themselves,
Mhm.
and they've made it fairly clear that their stance, at least in their own life, has been
Mhm.
to not.
Mhm. Mhm.
That is interesting. So if they've closed that
Very
off to themselves, how are they going to be open with their child?
Well, they're tremendous codependents. You know, the whole addiction scenario is very much applicable to the field of adoption, and there's a total denial of self, which is really very incapacitating. And the fact is, though, that as you educate about birth parents and about adoption issues, you may be helping them to get in touch with their own stuff. They may not be demonstrating that to you, but they're taking in the fact that birth parents love their kids. They may question it about their own. They're taking in the fact that over 95% of birth parents are open to contact. They're taking in the fact that birth parents love their children and always remember them. They're taking it in at some level. Now, some of it may be in a very protected kind of way, but they're taking it in. And so hopefully there will be some changes that will take place. I've had parents that had never searched, and as they got immersed in the adoption process, began their own searches. And as a matter of fact, when you talk about yesterday, someone that was in the group in our workshop is a young adopted woman that I did her search in San Antonio, and her adoptive mother was very threatened by the search. And her statement to the group was that she was very grateful that she did not wait until her mother died, because her mother died 6 months ago of cancer. Because what happened was, and this was a person that when she came to see me, talked about the fact she felt totally different and out of place within her family, who went through the very typical redefinition of self, who bonded much more closely with her family, and was able to rework her relationship and intimacy bonds with her mother. She said, I never would have had that opportunity had I not done my search before my mother died. That was a pretty dramatic statement. Again, a lot of the people who are non-searchers, and I feel very strongly that we can't make people search when we think the time is right. It's one thing when our kids are kids and we're accessing information for them or starting that contact, but I don't really think it's appropriate for us to do the search for our 35-year-old and say to the birth mom, hi, this is me, and your kid's over there. There's more responsibility to all of that. But this was, I thought, a very prime example of that lost opportunity for healing and intimacy and trust and permanence.
There were three, all women in the workshop that I went to yesterday who had missed opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the exact, one woman, her mother died when she was 3.
Mm-hmm.
And this unresolved grief and this is just tremendous.
Mm-hmm.
And the other two, I think were in search and found out about
Mm-hmm.
deaths that were
Mm-hmm.
similar to this, that were real close to, so
Mm-hmm.
I felt like they just missed,
Mm-hmm.
which was even more painful.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, as you're describing with this person, extremely
Mm-hmm.
full of pain.
Mm-hmm.
And it was,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a tremendous missed
Mm-hmm.
opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Now, this particular girl didn't miss the opportunity because she connected with her birth mother
Right before.
well, see, it's her adoptive mother who died. For her, the situation was that she was glad she did not wait until her parents were dead to do her search, but rather that she did it while everybody was alive and well, so that she was able to get close to her adoptive mom. She was able to redefine her place in that family while integrating her birth family. So her issues of wholeness and well-being were accomplished before her mother died. It's an ongoing process. I'm oversimplifying, but she had worked out a lot of stuff with her mom as a result of her search. And we have to help adoptive parents know that their children will often wait till, because of their own fears and issues and insecurities, that in protection of that relationship and of their feelings, that they will say, I will wait till my parents die, or I'm not going to tell my parents. And yet, the search is an incredibly bonding experience. I get totally close to people when I do their searches. It's like being in love and sharing in that romance with someone, you know, peeping Tom.
Maybe I misinterpreted something, but I got confused when earlier I thought you were saying that, maybe I thought you meant it in a general principle and you didn't. When an adult is doing the search, you don't
you don't encourage them to let the adoptive parents know that
Oh,
they're searching?
my
it's
position on
going
that,
out
my
there.
position on that, and I feel again validation and permission giving are so critical in what I do. My position is I try to learn from them without making them feel like I'm asking for justification, whether they're sharing with their parents that they're doing a search. A lot of times, the majority of times, they will say, no, I'm not telling my parents. I don't want to hurt them, and I think they'd be very upset, and on and on and on. What I try to convey to them is that it's up to them whether they make that decision. They can tell their parents or not tell their parents. I'm not going to push one way or the other. Their decision. They are adults. We have to do a lot of clear, expressed communication because there is so much insecurity. You are an adult. If you choose to tell your parents that you are doing a search, are you doing it asking for permission as a little child in the status of adopted child? Or are you doing it as an adult in a sharing capacity, not asking for approval or disapproval, but as a matter of fact sharing? It's a very different position to take, and it gives them some control and power. Now, some choose to take the risk because, like you say, can you take the risk of possibly these parents saying, I am going to withhold my affection, I am going to withhold the relationship. If you do this, I'm going to be hurt forever. And some will take the risk and tell them and then go with it. Some will, when discovering that their parents are falling apart, cut off the communication, which is very painful because that does bring about some guilt. And then we have to help reframe it. We do a lot of reframing in adoption as well, or in counseling.
This marks the end of session 20, tape 1. Now turn to session 20, tape 2.
And so again, it's empowering them. We have to help them be empowered because there's a lot of self-denial. You know, this guy you're talking about, the programming, adopted people will talk about the programming is so intense and goes on for so many years that they can't even define their needs. They can't even get in touch with their
Well, they're
needs.
usually also saying along with that, at least these few people that I met, I have a wonderful family.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, make it sound just about as perfect as it can be, and the people through my work, not this guy, but they've not even made the comment, and it would also hurt my adoptive parents. They just say, I've just never had the desire. Everything's just been fine and dandy and great, and I love my life, and
That's right. And they're not in touch with their feelings.
you know.
That's right. That's right.
Though I think I've come to be suspicious of the adult adoptee who says either my family was so wonderful I have no need at all to search, or the person that says I had a totally wonderful adoptive family, but I have a desperate need to search. Both of those make me a little suspicious. For one thing, I don't think there are any perfect families around, and so you know, it's the same thing if people come to me for help with their marriage or help with a terrible kid but tell me their marriage is absolutely perfect. I don't believe usually have the same thing in the same family. You know, a kid that's off the wall and a marriage that's absolutely perfect. So it's those kind of words around perfect and describing human relationships that make me very suspicious that what that really is denial.
Well, and remember that there's an image projection in all of this, in that the societal programming is that this is the way it has to be, and adoptive families have to be more perfect families. And so, again, in terms of your initial phone calls for people seeking search assistance will so often be that protected statement, all I want is medical information. And I had what I considered, I've had a lot of these experiences where there were encapsulations of major issues in adoption through a 20-minute conversation, part of my learning process. This guy called, because of our open adoption involvement, people from our agency were frequently featured on national TV shows. And on this particular occasion, they had been on Donahue. And as a result, you get calls from all over the country because these people that are products of closed adoption all of a sudden see all this open adoption and it just tears them apart. So this guy was calling from Florida, 35 years old. He started off his communication with, I'm really not interested in that woman. All I want is my medical information. I'm 35 years old and I need to know my medical information. So I proceeded on...
With sort of an angry tone like that?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, he was really very... And so I proceeded with a 20-minute monologue of
what I had learned in my conversations from adopted people and what their typical needs were, what I call my permission-giving strategy, and how birth parents tended to be available to their children and how they loved their children. It just went on for 20 minutes. At the end, he said, "Is it possible to love someone very much that you have never met?" We have to help those parents understand that our children are very protected. They protect themselves because they have to. Society sets them up. And men are more protected than women. In the search movement, we need to know that the majority of searchers are women. Now, there is a dramatic increase in the male search population, but every month I keep track of people that I've talked with, and they're primarily adopted people, and they're primarily women. But the men are increasing in number. Now, what's that all about? That the women are laying the groundwork by being real visible in the search movement, and little by little the men are surfacing, and they're taking the risk. And when they're showing their feelings, when they can trust you enough to show their feelings, they have the exact same feelings that the women have, the feelings of abandonment, rejection, need, voids. It's all the same exact vocabulary. It just takes them a heck of a lot longer to trust and share those emotions. So again, when adoptive parents say, "My kids have no questions, my kids have never wanted to search," I just completed a search a couple of weeks ago with a family that told me, and I had to contact the parents and the kid because even though he's 20, he's still living at home. And philosophically and ethically, I have struggled with that over the years a lot. And my position now is that if the adopted adult is living at home with parents, I can't treat them in total adult capacity, and I have to include the parents. That was my own internal struggle, and I'm working off of that now. And these parents were wonderful. And that's the other thing. We must never second guess anybody. That's when we have to take risks. Can you take the risk and the outcomes of those risks? I will be here to process with you and to support you no matter what the outcomes. But let's look at what the issues may be for you. So I don't second guess people, because even though adoptive parents are the hardest people to contact in my experience when the search is, say, being initiated by the birth mom, I can't second guess them because there's enough out there now that are open and supportive. Scared, yeah, some of them still, but there are enough of them out there that are willing to participate and help. So when I contacted this family, the way that I contact people, I've got a letter up there. When I am involving adoptive parents, I am writing a letter where I make contact by phone with birth parents and adoptees. I work almost exclusively on the phone for making contacts. When I am approaching adoptive parents, I send a letter because I learned that they got so freaked out by this phone call. And because I work all kinds of hours, I get people when I can get people. I may call them on a weekend and at night. It freaked them out really badly. So I developed a letter that goes from the non-threatening to the very threatening. And I start off with, as you may have seen in the media, there have been tremendous changes in our society about adoption. And then it goes on into, and our agency has learned about these changes. We have made modifications in our program. And we have found an increasing number of parties inquiring about the corresponding parties in adoption. And when again, third-party stuff. And when birth parents inquire, it's because da-da-da-da-da, and validate them as parents along the way. And then finally, towards the end of this thing, we get to, and the reason for this letter is that your child's birth parent has come forward. And then throughout, there will be validation of them as parents, because their greatest fear is that now they have lost their role in their child's life. So this is the process that after some time of hysteria with I figured that then they discharge some of their anger with the letter, if that's going to be. It doesn't mean that I'm able to link them in, because sometimes they just get furious and all I can get is a confirmation that child's alive and well, and that's all I can do when I'm intermediary for the agency. But at least I've gotten something. Plus, my belief is that even with hysterical parents that are totally closed to a contact at this point in time, you've opened the door. They can no longer tell themselves or others that birth mother is not available, doesn't care, has forgotten. They now have current information that birth mother remembers, cares, and is available. Because I will always integrate that into the letter. This birth mother has always remembered and loved that child and prayed for that child's well-being within their family. So you're doing lots of things in one letter. It's not necessarily the letter for everybody, but it's the letter that's been working for me. And I have so many goals within that letter, and that's what I'm trying for. Anyway, in this particular case, the family was very receptive to the contact. And what the parents said to me was that through the years they'd always told their son that any time he wanted to search, that was fine. They did the appropriate thing. All we can do as parents is validate and give permission. We can't say to the kids, we're going to do it now. They're not ready. They gave him permission all these years. So when I came forward with this contact, he knew it was okay with his parents. They were giving him lots of emotional and cognitive evidence of that, behavioral evidence. And now it started coming out. He'd always wanted to know. He just always was scared that his birth mother wouldn't want to know him. And so little by little, all this tenderness starts coming out. And they're able to link into this with their child at a time when young adults are not always sharing all this gut stuff with their parents. And what is happening? Increased bonding. Because he's going to get even closer to these parents. And when I did the prep session with them, they traveled over 2 hours to come see me, and both his parents came with him. And I find that it's very vital at that point not to exclude these very critical people. I don't believe in just doing it with the adoptee. And sometimes I find that the adoptive parents become self-effacing. This is his thing, this is his birth mother, or do we really have a right to participate? Are you okay with participating? Do you want to get to know this birth mom? I think she would welcome it. Because if the adults can build bonds, it's going to be that behavioral, emotional connection that's going to continue to give that kid a message that this is truly okay. And very often what happens, particularly with the younger adoptees, is that they're busy with their lives, they're dating, they're going to school, they may keep looser contact with the birth parents, and the adoptive parents are building those relationships. Kind of like the in-laws kind of stuff. You have in-laws that get close and in-laws that don't. But the connection is there at some level. And that connection will get defined by our affinity and what we have in common. And it's going to be a similar kind of journey. That also brings me to the vocabulary of what people call each other in these relationships. We find that adopted people will often start talking about their birth parents as my birth mother, Sandra. And as time goes by, what we learn is that they may give that birth mom a mom-related title, which for a lot of adoptive parents is very threatening. How can my child call her mom? I'm mom. And what's the typical thing? I stayed up at night when she was sick and she had a fever and I took her to the doctor when her leg broke. I stayed up all night with her. My God, is that all there is to parenthood? I also got to see her every day. I also got all the hugs. I got the kisses, you know? The reality is that it may feel comfortable to that adopted person to use that mom vocabulary with that birth mom. What I find is that typically by the time they get to that vocabulary, it's because it feels okay. It's still different from the mom feeling they have. You know, I think each party in our life will bring about different, you know, we have two grandmas, maybe we call them both grandma, but we have all kinds of emotions and memories tied to those grandmas. And one of the parallels that I like to draw that I think has some similarity is that when we get in-laws, some of us feel comfortable calling our in-laws mom, some call them Mrs., and some will call them by their first name. But each one of us handles that differently, and it doesn't mean that my in-law mom feels like my mom. It's just a word that feels okay to me. Some of us don't call them anything because we can't really feel comfortable about it in those words. But it's that kind of thing. And so what we have to keep remembering is that each relationship is unique and that we're not going to be displaced and that we have to trust the years that we have shared with these children or whichever other human beings are in our lives, that we're each going to have our own kind of relationship that will just develop in its own way. So because that vocabulary can be very threatening to adoptive parents. So again, to help them look, kind of like you talk about the divorce, let's help them look, reframe it. And I use the divorce a lot too when I do education in the community, because a lot of times there's such resistance to adoption and such negativism about adoption that I can get people reframing when I start talking about divorce. Any people here divorced, and some of you may be separated from one set of parents. Do any of you ever have questions about your missing parent? What kind of questions do you have? Well, it's all the same stuff as adoption. Does he ever think about me? Does he care about me? It's all the same kind of stuff. Abandonment issues. And when they start looking at it from that familiar territory, they can start relating more to the adoption experience. And it kind of lowers their defenses
and increases the receptivity to what we're talking about. So again, that reframing becomes real helpful in working with the adoptive parents to try to find something in their life. You talk about loss. Loss is so central to adoption, to help them see their own feelings about loss through infertility. The fact that they were going to have that imaginary child that never was, but about which child they may feel melancholy all their lives at various intervals. And that's okay and normal. And in no way does that deny the fact that they love the children they're raising. And that one doesn't have to interfere with the other, but that it may bring about some emotions that are necessary and healthy and normal. To help them look at other kinds of losses that they have experienced and how they have dealt with them. And how most people in dealing with loss have a need to talk about that lost person, that dead person, and acknowledge that person's existence, even though in our society the tendency is to keep it under covers. And yet the healthy way is to bring it out and to be able to talk and remember that person. That's part of the grieving process. So again, that reframing becomes real important. We're just about running out of time. Are there some issues that you would like addressed that maybe I haven't even touched upon, or something that you would like to share that would tie into what we've been talking about?
I'd just like to make an apology. I just looked in my book and realized that I had carefully read that this meeting started at 9:30.
The original thing did say that.
That's what they said.
Not crazy.
That's right.
Thank you. I
That's
just
right.
thought- Well, now, I thought I
You know what, the
double-checked that
original-
last
The
night.
very first flyer. said
Yes.
Oh, you know what, and I've had that with, thank you,
Yes.
because I thought, oh my
Well,
gosh,
you know
that
what?
was really
A
late.
gentleman came in and said.
Yes.
you may have to-
Yes.
Instead of 9, no?
It was, that's, what- yeah, they had two different programs. Uh-huh.
Okay, well, this, I
That's what
have
it
been
is.
hearing this one.
Uh-huh.
Oh, thank
Uh-huh.
you.
Uh-huh.
Because I was just, oh my goodness,
Uh-huh.
I owe you an apology. I
No,
was so late,
please.
I had not realized it.
No, don't ever apologize. It's,
If you have any downsides to talk about, are there any negatives that you would say?
my feeling is that the search is such a therapeutic intervention in terms of reality basing, dealing with the real world and real relationships, that the kind of vocabulary that I use is that life is made up of complex relationships, and therefore there will be complexities as we navigate our life, regardless of whether it's adoption related or husband related or friend related or whatever related. And so what we do is keep learning so that we can keep anticipating, recognizing, and dealing with whatever it is we're dealing with. And you will have some times when there will be complexities that may feel real uncomfortable, but they're not insurmountable. You will learn, process, counsel. Sometimes you'll need mediation. Sometimes you'll need counseling. But that's part of just dealing with the real world and dealing with the truth.
Well, I
And
was just going to say, someone made a comment to me that it's sort of a trade-off, that at least these issues are up on the table.
That's right.
instead of under the
That's
table
right.
versus-
That's right.
I mean, neither world is
That's right.
perfect, but this seems
That's
a lot more honest.
Very much so.
That's one of the tenets of family therapy,
Mhm.
is that family secrets always fester and cause lots of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the direct parallels I make to support
Mhm.
openness around adoption issues.
Mm-hmm.
If a family, whichever part of the family it is, whether it's the birth family or the adoptive family, can be open in talking about the
Mhm.
meanings of all these
Mhm.
things and the feelings with it, that may not be fun and it may not be easy.
Mm-hmm.
But in the long run, I really do
Mhm.
believe that
Mhm.
it's more healthy, and
Mhm.
it means that it's real and people can deal with the real
That's right.
things rather than, the other thing is that experience suggests that whenever people have to deal with things secretly,
Mhm.
their fantasies are always worse than the
Mhm.
reality,
Mhm.
and that's what
Mhm.
festers into
Mhm.
such
Mhm.
awful
Absolutely,
results.
absolutely. I have shared what I would consider absolutely horrendous information with people. And I do it in a way that I am sharing it with them factually, truthfully, not judgmentally, and then I am available to them afterwards to process. And one case that I remembered was I was working with an agency file, and I was sharing the information. The boy wasn't ready to do a search yet. He was like 20. And he just wanted the information contained in the file, which is typically the first safe step for a lot of people, just to see if they can deal with the social history. And the birth mother's was just kind of run-of-the-mill, whatever run-of-the-mill is, nothing dramatic, family kind of stuff. But then the information on the birth father was that he was in the penitentiary and, some pretty horrid stuff.
And I struggle because sometimes my contact with people is relatively brief, and I know that sometimes it's like hitting them over the head with some pretty tough stuff. But I felt that it was only ethical that he have the truth, and that I was going to be there with him to process it. And so I gave him the truth. And he lived several hours from where we were, and so I called him that evening, and I said, I just wanted to touch base with you and see how the information felt to you. And again, focus specifically on that particular information. And he said he's so grateful to know the truth, that he really was okay. It took him about 1.5 years to come to me to do the search. And I have to tell you that with regard to birth father information, that I have found that sometimes that information is rather inconsistent. Sometimes birth moms have given wrong names to protect the birth father. Sometimes they're angry at the guy. They don't want him to participate. And so while the percentage of, again, I've been doing this 9.5 years, while the percentage is not anything like 50%, it may be 5% where I have found it's the wrong name, the wrong information, the whole thing, I'm really cautious about looking for birth fathers. And this young man came to me to do the search, and I connected with his birth mother, who has been just, they're wonderful. And approaching birth moms is typically very easy because my statistics are so high that they're going to be open to contact. And what I learned from this birth mother, after I'd done all this sharing that this guy was in the penitentiary and he was a real crumb, the birth father's a doctor. And the reason she gave the wrong information on the birth father was that they told her that her son would never have the information about the birth father. 20 years, it was totally closed adoption. And furthermore, he was a family friend, and she didn't want anybody to know who he was. And so there you were, totally different scenario. So anyway, but the fact is I have shared that the adoptee who was adopted as an older child had VD as a child. I struggled. That was so early in my sharing of information. I struggled. How do I tell this person that her mother prostituted her? And even though she was adopted when she was about 11 and had been removed from her mother's family, there's so much blocking that happens in older child adoption that I was really having a difficult time, and yet feeling that ethically I needed to report to her the truth. And I shared the information with her husband present. And the two of them just gave a sigh of relief. They said that VD had surfaced in their marriage, and they had always wondered whether it had originated. And it was such a relief to learn that it was something that she had experienced as a child and had reestablished itself. So again, I have shared mental illness, I have shared prison, I have found birth parents in jail, just all kinds of things. And again, the vast proportion of birth families are just normal, whatever that is in our society, middle of the road America. And you do end up with the extreme sometimes of really hard kinds of information. But if what we can help the adopted person know that whatever that information is, it's not a statement about their self-worth. It's a statement perhaps about some genetic predispositions, some issues that they need to be aware of, but it's not a statement of self. And that has to be an issue that we work with them on.
Have you facilitated many of these situations in areas where maybe they've been the first, second, or third of that type in the society around? I mean, people think that I am nuts, that I am in the process of opening up my adoption. They absolutely, especially when they hear what the primary reason is. What happens to a young adoptee? And even, I don't think it's as crucial for the adoptive parents, because hopefully they are confident enough and grounded enough, but probably still too an issue when everyone else is.
It's a real lonely experience because you still have such huge geographical areas where there's no validation for your experience. And that's why,
Metropolitan area, and
that's right, that's right. And that's why networking is so vitally important. There's going to be an open adoption conference in California put on by the Independent Adoption Center. My co-author is Kathleen Silber, who wrote Dear Birth Mother, and her organization is going to be putting on this conference. And again, it's an opportunity for networking, and they've created a federation for open adoption. And I put some brochures downstairs. And again, that opportunity for networking, because we have found even families that went through our open adoption process totally convinced, totally comfortable, while they were still in that safe haven of support.
Right.
go back into their communities, which may be right there in San Antonio, where the San Antonio community that they're in is totally distrustful of this. And so again, they'll come back and say, are we really wise doing this? And is this really doing damage to us and our kids? And so again, you have to keep validating and continue to teach them, encourage them to read, and then to teach the important people in their lives to become educated too. To encourage them, buy the books for these extended people if they're willing to read them and learn. And
in an adoptive family.
that's right, that's right. And so, but sometimes you have to work long distance because it may be that in your community, they're just, as a matter of fact, one of the family, we see a lot of that, even from within our own families who got the total immersion. As a matter of fact, in our book, I cite a case of a family that was totally involved in open adoption. As a matter of fact, they were on Good Morning America several years ago when their daughter was much younger. Then they left the area. And they had been in personal direct contact with a totally open adoption. But then the birth mother was having a tremendous number of problems, and they didn't hear back from her. And so they started going to the conclusion that therefore she was not interested anymore, that this was probably too traumatic for her. And my statement to them was, don't second guess her. Check it out. Because my experience has been that that's not the case, that they may be dealing with their own world, they may be in terrible confusion and have their own problems that they're dealing with apart or next to the adoption. But don't second guess and maintain that avenue open. But what was happening is that they were totally isolated. They had no validation for what they were doing, and the doubts start creeping in. And so there has to be that ongoing support and validation. And sometimes it's by phone long distance. I do a tremendous amount of long distance work because people are scattered. Whether I'm doing searching or open adoption processing, it's just a long distance process. And while I would be the last to say that phone contact is optimum, it's just a necessity. My searching often has both parties in different geographical areas. So does that address what you're talking about? You have to feel confirmed in your heart that you're doing the right thing and that you are familiar with your specialty and that there's a lot of people out there that are totally unfamiliar. And when I say not just your plebeians in the community that have nothing to do with adoption, but I'm talking the professional community. We still have a huge segment of our professional community that's totally, who are the experts? The search group people are the experts. Who told me how to search? My main mentor was a searcher in Houston. She's the one that guided me and helped me. And then my callers, my own clients, were my teachers. There were no professional models out there. So you become the professional because of your immersion, and you build on that.
Definitely needs
Mm-hmm.
first.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there any other issue? Well, I really appreciate you all participating. Thank you. Thank you. I have the letter that I wrote just a minute ago here.
I'm trying to think of whether I already have your book or not. I got a pile of books at one point that I haven't gotten too thoroughly into yet.
Mm-hmm.
But does that cover some of the things you were talking about, the searches and intervention?
Yeah, because we have not just kids who have started off with open adoption over time, but we have a large number of kids who started off with closed adoptions that then became open adoptions. And we've done it developmentally, so they were kids that were the preschoolers, the school age, and then adolescents. And among the adolescents, we have kids that were very troubled adolescents, really messed up badly, and just run-of-the-mill adolescents who were just expressing a need for that contact. And it's just been lovely because these are kids that now several years have passed. And as a matter of fact, I touched base with one of my very early search contacts with a kid, and she's in there who was like 17 when we started her search, and she was just a mess. I mean, she was almost a street person. And as she looks back, she said it was such a perfect timing for her because it was such a turning point time for her. And some of it has been maturity, but some of it has just been the completion of the cycle for her in terms of having access to all of this. It was nice to have the 8 years later feedback that, we all need that confirmation.
Well, I'll tell you, I like to have autographed books, so I'll get one.
Oh,
If you'll
all right.
autograph it.
Well, of course. I'd be glad to.
And then if I already have a copy, I'll give my unautographed copy to the Family Institute's library.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Is this just out?
It came out in February of this year.
Yeah, my sister did. Okay.
would you like
And what
it?
is your first name?
Miriam.
Miriam.
It cooled off in here again, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Guess I should pay for it too.
It's
Probably
$9.95.
$9.95, well, that's a bargain.
You take a check?
Sure.
Where do you work?
I work in Cleveland, residential treatment center Belfair.
Oh, Belfair, my goodness.
We
You have a high,
have a lot of kids from here. in Chicago.
do you have a lot of adopted kids?
Yeah.
I was talking with a former student of mine who works for the Wilson Center in Minneapolis, I guess it is. And she was back in Chicago. We got together and I did an interview with her about her observations of the rate of adopted kids in adolescent treatment and what their staff thought were some of the rather repeated dynamics that had come up. So, and are these kids, do the adoptive kids that get welfare, are usually they're not going back to their families? I mean, is it like the last ditch thing?
No,
that
no,
they had?
no, no, not more so than the other kids.
I see.
I think a high percentage of our kids do return to family. I hope we'll be able to help. You know, it's adoption as an issue, as a core issue, was not identified even in our agency. We just started. My wife is the adoption coordinator for the agency. She just started a group. And we even had some challenge to it. It was a little worse than just, you know, I sometimes you overlook things, and we weren't asking people in general if they were sexually abused, and you find out how many.
Yeah.
Okay, so you miss things. But here, where it was identified initially, some of the administrators they still didn't list it as a priority issue yet. They weren't saying it was unimportant, but we have these kids in several different types of, you know, like there is, they use this as an example. A kid who's going to a chemical dependency, a sexual abuse program, and you know, hearing, and now we want adoption concentration. So far, it does still, no matter how much is there, it has to all be integrated. It's got to take care of these issues.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
I've been involved with family therapy training in Chicago here for quite a long time. And my impression was both from my colleagues as well as students. The students come from all over the place, so taps into lots of different agencies and so forth. Is that most of the family therapists, even though they're very tuned into loss issues and they're very tuned into remarried families,
Right.
where, I mean, I've used that parallel
Right.
a lot
Right.
about the two families with two sets of parents. That's
Mhm.
to be remarried families as well as adoptive families. But that the clinicians are so unfamiliar with the issues of adoption that whether they even know that there's such a relationship in a family, they don't do anything with it specifically because they don't know what to do.
They don't.
Right. Well, and I guess what's so distressing too is that I do a lot of conference presentations. $9.95. What's so distressing is I put in proposal after proposal, and sometimes I'll get, it's like the Marriage and Family Conference, they were in San Antonio. And first of all, what they did is they put our workshop, what was it, about 8:15 in the morning? 8:15 in the morning on a Sunday. So that positioning in itself tells you something.
Sure.
And then very few people come because they don't realize there's anything to know.
You don't know.
And, but you're right, it's reframing for them that they really have all the skills it takes to work with adoption, but they've got to reframe to understand how it's going to link in. And then they've got to get the data. In other words, they've got to learn that birth parents never forget and that they're available and all that kind of thing. So we are seeing more of this reporting back where there may be therapists doing long-term therapy with clients, identifying the adoption issue, and they'll send them to me for adoption-related stuff, for the more in detail. and then I send them back, because I'm just doing short-term, that's my plug-in. And that's been real good, because it's not so threatening to them. They know I'm not gonna keep their clients. And so then they can start integrating and meshing their issues that integrate, while we have done the adoption stuff, that of course will tie into their stuff, but, so.
I just started working with a family that they had this boy, at least in 4 different state places. He was at Mangas for a while.
Thank you.
And in the first session, when I was doing a genogram, and they started to ask, and I said, well, so you've gotten some help with the adoption issues? And they looked at each other. I said, do you know what I mean? And they said, no. And then I asked the boy, who I heard had all this years of individual treatment, I said, did anybody help you? And he said that the psychiatrist said once, by the way, I just want you to know that I know that you've been adopted. And that was it. That was the extent of any reference to this family's work.
Yeah.
And they appropriately got nervous because I started there, and I would not have started there because I don't start with any of the, if there was alcohol, I do not do that because I don't believe anything is the only issue.
Right.
But they were so much on the other side
Right.
that I said, you know, you don't know me, you're going to have to trust that it's not the only thing, but I'm going to make it the only thing for a while. It's the only thing that hasn't been attended to at all,
Right.
from what I could see.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, so
yeah.
now we're doing fine at this
Yeah.
point. But
Yeah.
they went to some very special
Yeah.
places, but
Yeah.
didn't get help.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but see, because you are in that community, you could be a real pivotal person
Mhm.
with that, and that professional kind of, because really, when I tell you that meeting down there was a national, largely represented conference, I was appalled. I wasn't surprised. I
Right, I
expected it.
understand.
That's why I wanted to be there.
Yeah.
But I was still appalled. There's no excuse any longer. 10 years ago, there would have been an excuse for any of us to say, well, we just are saying a lot of dumb stuff because we don't know any better. But nowadays, there's just no excuse for it. There's too much material out there.
Well, the first couple of times that I put in adoption-related bids to AFTA and AANFT, they got turned down.
Mm-hmm.
Then, the next time I got one in to AA,
Mm-hmm.
it was on Sunday morning,
Mhm.
right when a lot of people were leaving, and there was a little
Mhm.
football game going on in town.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
So that was kind of a mixed
Yeah.
bag. However, I've been noticing that, and I and a woman from St. Louis are trying to get an interest group going for AFTA on adopted families.
Mhm.
We don't know, apparently they're getting so many bids for interest groups that we're not sure yet quite how